Thank you for being patient with us and coming to a 9 a.m. meeting on the very last day of IDW. So welcome. My name is CJ Woodford. I am a co-chair for the Global Open Research Commons Working Group. I'm a research associate with the World Data System in the International Technology Office. And so I'm just going to open the session and also pass it off to some of my co-chairs to present as well. I'm going to move this all the way over here. There we go. So Global Open Research Commons, what it takes on the road to get there, reflections and discussion on creating a commons attribute model and a commons integration roadmap. So this is a combined session between the interest group and the working group, just to be clear on that part. And we want to give a warm welcome to all the Research Data Alliance newcomers. Thank you for being here. I've sent the collaborative notes out on the Zoom chat. So for everyone attending online, please feel free to open those notes, add your name. And for everyone in the room, I encourage you to do so as well, either now or after the session. If you're like me, and I don't usually have my Wi-Fi on during the session to save battery life. So there's that. So what are we going to cover today? So in this session, we're going to be reviewing some recently submitted outputs of the interest group as well as the working group. We're going to talk about some next steps. We're going to have some discussion. We're going to say what are some next steps that are already underway, which is pretty exciting. So this is a great time to jump on board if you're interested. A little plug. And so we're looking to do some of that work starting in 2024, but this is a quick rundown of the agenda. It's a little bit more granular than that, as you'll see, but you'll be hearing from me. I'm CJ, Andrew, and Sarah, who I will ask to introduce themselves when they get up because I cannot remember your titles all at once, sorry. So the very first thing we're going to do is do some welcome and icebreakers, and I'm going to pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks very much, CJ.
So we're going to go over to your...
Yep. So if you can open up Menti, we just have a couple of questions just to really wake up the room after the drinks last night, just to see what you know about the Commons already. Ooh. Ooh. How can I get that into the full screen? How do I get over to this screen? Just to put this in full screen. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can't see it on the screen directly, so we gotta kind of feel it.
Ah, okay.
Like that? That looks better.
Perfect. Okay. So what you think of when you hear the word commons? So alignment, standardization, consistency, which ties in with the model because we're trying to make things more consistent across the different commons. Yeah, excellent. Good terms coming in here. Shared. I think when we first used the term commons, we were looking at the shared infrastructure we have. So kind of common spaces. And that ties in with what we're doing with the research commons as well, trying to share the data and the infrastructure. So coupling and value. So good terms coming in here. Thank you very much. And 29 is probably capturing most of the room. So I will move on. Yeah, I know, but it's getting over to that screen. Here we go. I have it now. Okay, so whether you've heard of the GAWK group, so most people have, which is reassuring. Just over half have already heard. Some people are unsure whether they've heard of GAWK. But we'll be filling you in all about the work of the working group and the interest group during this session. And some newcomers, which is good as well. So we can let you know what we've been developing and the outputs that we have. Next question, what sort of organization are you from? Most people from research institutes, a couple of funders in the room, lots of service providers, which is really key in terms of the research commons infrastructure. So good to have service providers. Does anyone want to suggest what they put as other, where they're from? You can just shout out. But learned societies. Okay, excellent. That's also a really useful dimension to bring in terms of the standards from the different domains. Okay, and last question here, looking at where people are from geographically as well. So USA and Canada, people from Australia, Europe, we've got Belgium, France, Czech Republic, Sweden there, South Africa as well. So we've got quite a diverse group in the room, which is good to see, which will help with the discussions. Okay, the final question we have is for later on for the discussion. So I will leave it at that and hand it back for the slides for CJ, I think, or is it Andrew presenting first? Okay.
Thanks, Darren. Mouse. We have a mouse? That's, oh, we're using that mouse to drive this, okay. Yep.
Where's the mouse going?
It's probably hiding over there.
It's over here, actually.
Oh, okay.
And then, yeah, putting up in full screen. Do you want to do that by keystrokes?
So can I just use this to drive it?
I don't know.
Okay, don't worry. The joys of multiple monitors.
Yeah, sorry, folks. There we go. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. As you can see, CJ was and continues to be invaluable for the work of the group. So I'd like to give you some context for the interest group. As CJ has already identified, this is a joint session between the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group and the International Model Working Group. Confusingly, some of us are co-chairs of both of them. So the GORC IG started first. And the original idea for the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group was we saw this increasing amount of activity around Open Science Commons, Open Data Commons, Open Research Commons. And we were looking at those and thinking, well, what you really want is you want something that sits above those, that tries to provide some sort of international commons where people can go to work with colleagues and access resources. And so the vision we had for this Global Open Research Commons that doesn't exist yet, but which we're all helping to build, is that you'd get frictionless access to a whole range of research artifacts. So the publications and the data and the software that let you do things with the data and the models and the workflows and a whole range of things. So that was the model that the interest group was seeking to produce. And so one way of visualizing it is like this. You've got all of these different kinds of things. Wow, even floppy disks. All of these different kinds of things that are then connected in ways that are hopefully of use to the researcher up in the top right-hand corner. One of the long-term plans for the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group is that we build a roadmap for commons integration. So part of the work plan for the interest group is coming up with a roadmap. CJ, when he created the roadmap, said he was worried that it looked a little bit chaotic and higgledy-piggledy. I actually think this is a reasonable representation of where we are. We do have lots of things. They're not connected particularly well. The paths between them are, I don't know, rough dirt tracks. We haven't got to highways yet. But the plan is that we will be developing this roadmap. And as the first step in the roadmap, we really wanted to get a sense of what the landscape looked like at the moment. So we knew that there were lots of different commons, but we, didn't have a clear sense of what those commons provided. We didn't have a good way of thinking about what the elements in a commons needed to look like. And we didn't have a shared vocabulary for talking about the sorts of services that a commons might provide. And so the idea was that the International Model Working Group, and much of this morning's session will focus on the outputs from that group. The idea was that the working group would enable us to get a clearer sense of what the terrain looked like so we could build the roadmap, to talk to the analogy a bit. Okay, so the interest group started in 2018. The interest group was and is meant to be a place where people who care about commons can come together to discuss ideas. And the first thing that we did in the interest group was try and come up with what we call a typology of essential elements for commons. So what are the things that you need to have in a commons? Now, clearly none of us are in marketing. Typology of essential elements is not something that rolls off the tongue, and we possibly need to do some work on that, but that's what we're currently calling it. So this was an output from the interest group that came out in early 2023. And I should, for those of you that are new to RDA, working groups produce outputs. Interest groups can produce outputs, but they're often called supporting outputs. They're not formal recommendations. And it's less common for an interest group to produce an output. But in this case, we thought the work that we'd done was sufficiently useful that we wanted to describe it. And so that typology of essential elements is this. And for those of you that are interested, our very good friends at RDA Tiger, look for the Tiger lanyards, have produced some brochures that, there we are, Ari, thank you, Ari, wave, there we are, have produced some very helpful brochures. If you're interested in a little bit more detail on the essential elements, we have a brochure on adopting and implementing the model, and another brochure for people who are thinking about policy. There's some up here, and I think there are still some more on the Tiger stand. So this is the high level typology, and you'll see this again when CJ talks about the model. So the idea is that we were trying to capture all of the things you need to have for commons to work. Now, across the bottom are the obvious things. So these are, if you like, the more conventional technology elements. You've got hardware and associated authentication and network services. You've got tools and services on the right-hand side. You've got a whole range of different kinds of research objects, the data, the publications, the software, the models that I've talked about already. So those are, if you like, the things that perhaps many people think of when they think of a commons. And then we recognize, well, you actually need a whole pile of other things across the top, what you might think of as governance and policy elements. So you need people to actually make sure the commons is going to work, the human capacity. You need what we're currently calling rules of participation and access. This is an idea that we stole from the EOS. How do you get to use the commons? How do you get to contribute services and data into the commons? You need some kind of governance structure to make sure that the commons is going to be run effectively. You need to engage with your users and indeed with your service providers. And you need some model for sustainability. And then at the core of all of this is the need for interoperability and standards. And so the idea behind the model is that if you're building a commons, you need to at least think about what you're going to do for each of those hexagons. The model is not prescriptive, but it does guide you as to the sort of questions you might need to ask. And CJ will go into more detail on that. So the diagram has been published on Zenodo. That's the DOI for it. It's linked from the outputs page for the interest group. We also realized, sorry if I just go back, we also realized when we were designing this that what we thought we meant by sustainability was not necessarily what other people meant by sustainability. And so that first citation there has got a set of linked definitions. So it has the model as well as the definitions, so you understand what we mean by each of those terms. But if you want the diagram alone, that's available too. Of course, as with almost everything that RDA produces, these are licensed under Creative Commons, so feel free to take them and use them. And I think it's now time to hand over to CJ to talk about the working group and the kind of the main thing we want to showcase for you this morning.
All right, so thank you, Andrew. Right, so now that you've got a pretty good idea of what happens in the interest group and the work that kind of was happening before as well as alongside the working group, I'll talk a little bit more about the working group side. So in the working group, we tried to hear from a bunch of different commons representatives, or what we were trying to identify as commons. So essentially digital research infrastructure platforms, which includes a bunch of different things. So we were trying to understand what the community was looking like, what the perspectives were, what they were offering, what their concerns were, how they were growing, this sort of thing. So before the 20th plenary, which was in March of this year, we had already started a speaker series, and we had heard from 8 speakers between November of 2021 and February of 2023. There were some gaps in there, as you can imagine, but leading up to the 20th plenary, that we actually had heard from 8 people already. And we had done a phase 1 literature review feeding into the model. Part of that literature review was also information about the speakers. So anything that, not only what they presented during their presentations with us, but also anything that we could find online about them, their annual reports, information about their funders, if they had one, their policy documents. I seriously mean it that I combed through pretty much every page on every speaker's website when we do this. This phase 1 literature review, which was information about the speakers, but also resources from the community as well as RDA outputs, formed a model. And it wasn't quite a model to begin with. It was kind of like a running list that was a bit of a mess at first. As you can imagine, it was an iterative process. So it all fed into this kind of mess that I'm calling a model in the diagram here, but it was a mess. So then we started structuring it according to the typology, because again, the interest group was working alongside the working group here. So we said, all right, the interest group has defined a typology of the essential elements of a commons. The model can use that as a structure for the things we're finding, or the attributes we're finding commons are describing themselves with, or that the community, when they publish reports or when they publish research papers, are defining that they need to see. So that started giving us a framework, and that's when it started really looking more like a model. We had, up to the 20th plenary, 20 working group meetings. And we had also broken out into 5 task groups to work on different parts of the model, which I'll address here in a second, but in terms of which areas they took on. But through this iterative process of meetings and task group meetings, and while we had monthly meetings for the working group as a whole, the task groups met on like outside of those. Some task groups met multiple times a week for months on end. Seriously. And others only met rarely, but did a ton of work asynchronously. So this went through a lot of review from a lot of different people. And part of that iterative process was realizing that the typology wasn't perfect in its first go. So there was some feedback between the working group and the interest group where we said, okay, we're looking at what commons actually have. And we're seeing that maybe the names of some of the essential elements, the definitions of some of the essential elements in the typology don't quite fit. So there was back and forth between the typology and the model, between the interest group and the working group. So that was up to the 20th plenary, and we presented our work at that point, and we gotten some community takeaways. So first of all, the interest group did not have a session at the 20th plenary. It was only the working group. So this was largely feedback for the working group at that point. But what we kind of heard from y'all is that people were waiting to see what we were working on. And they wanted to refer to it and use it, even if it was in a draft stage. So that was really encouraging and really exciting, but also kind of told us, get it out formally so that I can cite this properly. It was very clear that our narrative documents about our methodology and the way that we were working needed some work. So I'm happy to say that we do have an actual report to show you. We needed to consider presentation formats besides spreadsheets, because spreadsheets are a little bit hard to navigate. And we needed to increase the transparency of the working group. So anyone here who's an interest group chair or working group chair, you've been getting a lot of emails from me about review this, review this, review this. That's because of that. We were told that we don't have enough showcased on our RDA website, that we're not engaging with the community enough. And so we really, really tried to change that over the past 6 months. And I hope that we did so. I'm seeing some nods. They're like, yes, we're sick of your emails. Excellent. That's what I wanted. Okay, so since the 20th plenary, what have we done? So, there's this back and forth between the typology and the model. Since the 20th plenary, the typology has been published on Zenodo. So these are supporting outputs, not recommendations. So I'm not going to say that RDA recommends the typology, but we're working on that part too. So the typology actually did go out and it was endorsed, published, depending on the word that we should use there, on July 26th of this year. So that's one thing. That's one big thing that happened. So that's check mark. Great. We heard from more speakers. So we completed our speaker series, and overall we heard from 12 different speakers. And I encourage you to ask questions or come to see me afterwards to talk about who exactly was represented and even who wasn't. But I'm not going to run through all of our people right now. We did a second stage literature review. So this is now a lot of information that fed into the model in these outputs in an iterative literature review process. And it was about 150 sources that we accumulated into forming the model. We did not hit everything we want. There is an absolutely huge more things to review document for future work. So we are still looking at that too, to see new publications that are coming out and new outputs from the RDA community. We continue to use our task groups, and the folks in the room who were part of those task groups can say, yes, we're so glad that this is finally done, because those meetings every week, sometimes multiple times a week, as you can imagine, were quite exhausting over the past 6 months. We did also break out a sixth task group from our original 5. We found that there was literally too much work for 5 task groups. So this resulted in not just an iterative review of the model, but also a report, which was done by a separate writing group. So we had 6 task groups and a writing group working on both the model and the report. And as of yesterday, they are up on Zenodo and published. So you can go look at them, which is super exciting. And I'm going to have QR codes here in a moment. And 28 working group meetings. I missed that part. So overall, in the lifespan of the working group, we had 28 meetings. Okay, so we did want to give a little bit of an introduction to what our outputs actually look like. So we've been saying the model, and Andrew's run through the typology from the interest group. But what was kind of the intent? So as Andrew kind of hinted on as well, the model is a first attempt to describe granular components of a commons. And it was intended to supply a framework and common language to stakeholders who are committed to developing interoperative research services. So this digital research infrastructure that's what we're trying to support, or this is what we're trying to describe in some way. It's the target audience for these outputs is really anyone who's planning to develop one, build one, fund one, write policy that could dictate anything about research. This is for you. That's why we have these 2 pamphlets, as Andrew's also said, that RDA Tiger made for us, because there's a wide stakeholder group, we believe, for this model and the report. So the first thing, and we're going to say this multiple times, because when you come in with a theory or a framework, it can feel like you're dictating to people what you should and should not do, and that's not the purpose. The working group was specifically designed such that we are not creating benchmarks. We are not creating an assessment tool. This is not an evaluation matrix, although those are future work options that we can discuss. But the model itself is intended as a guideline. It's intended as a set of considerations that some will be very, very relevant to you depending on your context, and others might not be. And that's totally fine. They'll be relevant to someone else in a different context, because there's no really 2 research commons that look the same. We all have different national contexts and international contexts, different types of data, and so on and so forth. So it's not prescriptive. That's the one thing I want to highlight. It does still sit in a spreadsheet. For now, we are working on more interactive and easier to digest containers for it, but our main goal push here was to actually get the concepts and the content out there, and to worry about the container that they came in afterwards. It's organized, as I've said, by the interest group essential elements, broken down into categories and subcategories. So this model is a set of entities as well as attributes and features. So entities and characteristics that you can think about as you build your commons or look at improving it or developing new things. So there's some organization now. Everything in the model, so every item, every row, has not only a label or a name of what it is, but also an extended description, examples where we could find them. And some of the examples are long, many examples. So there's lots of content in there. Primary sources that we use to kind of justify having that in the model, and also places that you can go to learn more about any one particular item, as well as a consideration level. So the consideration levels, there's 3 tiers, core, desirable, and optional. And that was what we felt in terms of the core considerations are the ones that you might want to consider considering first. Again, it's not prescriptive, but we did find that some core categories and core subcategories did emerge, like having a strategic plan. That's a core consideration to have. It also is complemented by a glossary. So the glossary is, a low-level semantic object, but it is part of the model in that same spreadsheet. And it's because we refer to specific words a lot. Like, what do we actually mean when we say research object? Because we know that that can have a couple of different definitions. What exactly do we mean by interoperability? So we have a glossary that accompanies it so that we're not confusing words depending on different contexts. It's in the model context. And lastly, part of this work was also to identify key performance indicators and metrics. And these are a starting list organized by themes as well. There's more KPIs and metrics to put in there. There's always going to be something different for different contexts, but this is a good place to start if you're wondering about what should I be measuring to indicate the success or have value proposition for my commons. The report that accompanies the model has a little bit more background information and intent around what the model is supposed to do and who it's for, a really detailed methodology. So kind of a extended version of what I just ran through in terms of all of our task group work and literature review and how we did that in fine detail, a narrative summary of the model, and the current intended use of the model. And then, of course, areas of future work, which we're also going to be discussing. So due to the size and scope of the items in the model, we've been talking about the model, and the typology you can see has 9 or 10, depending on how you count it, essential elements, but the model has about 400 items in it. So that's why we had to break out into task groups. In phase 1, we had 5 task groups and they covered specific essential elements. In phase 2, we created 6 task groups, as I said. And that was actually because the KPI and metric part of the model, we realized it doesn't actually really sit in the essential elements of a commons. It's a little bit, it's not actually really captured in the typology, and that's okay because they're measurements, they're indicators. So there's a 6 task group, which will have a slide later on about the KPIs and metrics. So what I'd like to do now is give you a little bit of an overview of the work that the task groups did, and also in the same vein, a little bit of a summary of the model before you dive into that spreadsheet or the report. So task group 1 reviewed everything in governance and leadership, rules of participation and access, and sustainability, in addition to KPIs that we kind of associated with those areas in phase 1 only. So in terms of governance structures or governance and leadership, as it's called in the model, it focused on an organization's purpose and development of strategies, objectives, values, and policies to frame how that purpose is pursued by management and internal personnel of the commons. It included the development of, as I've already mentioned, strategic plans. That includes mission statements, values, organizational performance metrics, how you handle them rather, not what they are, risk management frameworks, policies and guidelines for financial and operational matters, how you incorporate community endorsed principles and frameworks like FAIR and data ethics, or how important they are to your commons, the creation and maintenance of the governance structures, and the interaction with stakeholders, as well as ways of working. So all of that stuff is in governance structure, and that's a sampling of some of the categories that we identified for governance and leadership. Rules of participation and access then define how people interact with your commons as well as interact with each other inside of it. The rules are kind of designated to ensure that principles of open research, collaboration, and transparency are upheld, and that there's good ethical considerations in regards to using the commons resources, both internally and from the outside. All the commons users and resources are usually governed by rules of participation and access, but the rules and applications vary by commons. So how you frame them and what you write will be dependent on your context, but we have we identified some core ideas in the rules of participation and access. Sustainability, the big one with the $sign. The sustainability includes models and agreements made on how to ensure the viability and operations of the commons, and that does include funding. But it's also about resourcing activities. It's about knowledge management, sustainability of the knowledge of your commons. It's about sustainability of internal personnel existing in your commons. So it kind of includes more than one idea of sustainability in that way. It also includes developing long-term strategies and plans for operations and holdings. So even transition plans and what to do if your commons is no longer funded or collapses in some way. What are your backup plans? That's all part of sustainability. Task group 2 handled engagement and human capacity. So engagement is one of the social and human elements, obviously, and it's really required to make the commons succeed, because if you're not engaging with your stakeholder communities, there's no one really using your commons. They don't know what you're doing. So this is a pretty important one. So we kind of took this as an iterative cycle, and it requires some gathering exercises, consultations, usability testing, communications, as well as other types of engagement that you can think of, like even the format for what your training and education plans can look like. A core attribute of this one was efficient and effective engagement, plan to structure, coordinate, and share the relevant level of information, or what, to the right target audience, who, and addressing specific requirements of why they should engage with your commons and at the right time and frequency. So this is the communications plan aspect. So we've kind of broken down what you can consider as you create communications plans or improve the ones that you already have. The human capacity part of a commons is something that sometimes gets forgotten, but is really, really essential, as is evidenced by it being in the typology in the first place. What we're envisioning as human capacity includes all human individuals and entities that could be considered any kind of stakeholder. So that includes users, providers of data or services, members of the commons. So if you've got organizational partnerships, it also includes intermediaries, like policymakers, publishers, and funders, and also the internal personnel of the commons itself. So the people that are actually running your stuff. This includes a review of the past, present, and future of your human capacity, and what your commons wants to do in terms of that human capacity and supporting all the stakeholders. This also addresses some of the skills you might think about for things like planning and managing, assessment and assessing service delivery, and the skill requirements for the commons community. So what are you expecting your users to have when they start interacting with your commons versus what are you kind of helping them with as they start interacting with those services and tools? Task group 3 covered what we're calling ICT infrastructure, or information communications technology, which is highlighted here in the typology as compute, storage, network, and authorization and authentication infrastructure, or AAI. So there's a bit of a misnomer between the graphic and what we're actually calling it, but just to be clear, that's what that means, as well as research objects. So ICT infrastructure are the hardware and software components that are needed to make your commons do what it's supposed to do. So we kind of identified main themes around that: network, compute, storage, base software, and authorization and authentication infrastructure. There's lots of attributes and subcategories that go in there, but those are the main cruxes of ICT infrastructure that we identified. Research objects is a tangly subject, I know, but we were considering it as outputs of the research process that can be inputs into later processes as well. So a very broad view. And the scope here was very much limited to digital research objects. So we are not considering at this point research hardware, but that is a future work aspect of the model that we'd like to include in maybe a version 2.0, is to start thinking about how do instruments play into a research commons, and how can we account for that as even research objects being treated at themselves. The 5 main categories that we did identify are publications and research documentation, research data, research software, semantic objects, and collections of any of those things combined. Task group 4 covered that really big central connecting piece of interoperability and standards. This is actually 2 essential elements, but in the diagram, they kind of rolled into one because you usually consider interoperability and standards in the same headspace. It also looks nicer. 10 hexagons would have been hard to fit on that diagram. So that's why I think it's like that. But interoperability is the ability of data or tools from non-cooperating resources to integrate or work together with minimal effort. It can also enable a wider range of cross commons use cases. And so what we were considering here, and we kind of narrowed it down really, really intently to technical interoperability, or how artifacts are exchanged. That actually encompasses syntactic interoperability and semantic interoperability in our understanding. Pragmatic and organizational interoperability, and then legal interoperability as well. Even though we only had a few main ideas in interoperability, I do want to highlight again, the model is a little expansive. So there's a lot more captured into those. So if you're saying like, oh, but that doesn't sound like it captures everything, we're gonna go through the model here in a second. And it may in fact actually capture what you're thinking, but we're also interested in hearing feedback. The standards and conventions part is we're thinking about repeatable, harmonized, agreed, and documented ways of doing something. Standards maybe being more formalized or accepted on a wider community basis, and conventions being even maybe internal to your specific context. But it's really about how are you doing X thing. And so, okay, yeah, that's what I said. We're good. I don't need to say all that. Services and tools was handled by task group 5. And this went through a metamorphosis a couple of times. So this was not only an iterative process for task group 5 between phase 1 and phase 2, when it changed members in that task group, but its format changed significantly. And it was actually the conversations in task group 5 that led us to the format of the model as it is now, using entities and characteristics. It's also the area of the model, I think, that is going to have a lot of influence from the work currently being done in the Research Data Alliance. And we'll see more of that as outputs come out and we're able to incorporate that in. So again, the model is also a bit dynamic. We have a version 1, but we are looking to do future work on it. So for our context, what we defined a service as is any commons element that can be invoked by the user to perform some action on their behalf. Usually intended for use by machines, and invoked by software. Tools enable the researcher to perform one or more operations, typically on data and often with data as the output. And we're considering tools as usually being intended for use by humans directly. So again, in this context, we're excluding physical instruments as tools. So that's not included in the model right now, and we know that, and it is an area that we want to explore. Some of the examples of services and tools that we identified are research object repositories, discovery services, services and tools that are for direct research tasks, services and tools that enable workflows and middleware, like communications or like collaborative platforms, persistent identifier services, vocabulary and semantic object services, data management services and tools, commons catalog of all these services and tools, and also security and identification services in addition to help desk or support for the users. So that's a fast overview of the model as a whole from the 5 task groups that worked on it. And I missed this in the beginning. I only said this for task group 5, but between phase 1 and phase 2 of our reviews, the membership of the task groups changed. So this wasn't one task group that worked on one area for an extended period of time. Depending on your definition of extended period of time, 6 months is a long time, I think. But we actually did change membership because we wanted to get different perspectives on different areas of the model. So this has been through somewhat of a rigorous iterative process. But as I mentioned, we were intending to look at key performance indicators or KPIs and metrics. And originally we had them kind of squished into the model, and it was realized that that's not an appropriate way to address them. We also arrived at a lot of anxiety around talking about key performance indicators and metrics. And so we felt it was best to kind of pull them out of the model, have them as their own separate set of considerations. It's in the same spreadsheet, but out of the model. And they were handled by task group 6. So this was a new task group that we had in phase 2. So what we're talking about when we say KPIs or key performance indicators is that they're qualitative or quantitative measures that a commons stakeholders, and the community of commons can use to measure uptake, engagement, use of attributes and features, and other things that are of importance, which would be described in your strategic planning. So in contrast to that, we're saying metrics are maybe somewhat different because they're typically quantitative measures, percentages, averages, rates, that are used to assess the evolution or performance of specific processes and then inform how well you're doing on a particular key performance indicator. And so while we've got a bunch, actually 106 suggested KPIs and metrics, we did identify some common themes around them. And so we've actually provided a framework within a framework for those, how to navigate those key performance indicators and metrics. And that included feedback and satisfaction from stakeholders, evaluations of commons infrastructure and technology, the measurement of engagement with your stakeholders, and a measurement of how you're doing with your commons policy, governance and policy activities. And as I said, for the whole model, of course, that's a set of considerations. It's not a prescriptive list. We're not saying, okay, this is 106 KPIs and metrics that you have to use. That wouldn't be reasonable. But it is a set of KPIs and metrics that have been used by commons that are currently running. It's a set of KPIs and metrics that are suggested by RDA outputs, as well as in publications in the digital research infrastructure community. And so what we've tried to do is pull them from again, these 150 sources we did in the 2-stage literature review and say, this is a starting set that you could consider if you're wondering how to measure success, or what might be of interest for you to think about tracking. Okay, so as I said, the outputs are out. I apologize if the QR codes are fuzzy. If they're fuzzy, the DOIs are there. We also have them linked in our collaborative notes, so you can find them that way. And of course, they're also on the RDA Tiger pamphlet. So there's lots of places to get them, but it is really exciting because they're actually up on Zenodo and citable now. And what I wanted to do at this point was open it for discussion on the model and the report, knowing that I've been talking a lot. So, but I also am very happy to show you what the report and the model look like. But before I, get out of full screen, I do want to see if there's any questions from online or in the room just off the bat. Yeah, do we have microphones? Just for the people online so they can hear everyone.
Wim Hugo of Dans, thanks very much. As you probably know, we are looking to integrate the GORC typology quite closely into the RDA's facilities for recording activity and outputs and publication. So that's already integrated. But do you have in mind to publish the typology in some persistently referenceable way? Because we're going to need that if we want to embed the terminology of the GORC into any graph-like infrastructure.
So first of all, I love that, that it's being integrated. I was in that session. I was very excited when I saw that on your slides, Wim. So thank you. In terms, so I do want to I want to clarify what you mean when you say the GORC typology. Do you mean the interest group typology of the essential elements, or like the vocabulary list we had in the model?
Yes, so the vocabulary essentially, because we've integrated it at the moment as a set of elements and features and attributes that are interrelated in a hierarchy that people can select to annotate content with and reference outputs and so on and so forth at any level of granularity that fits the situation. But of course, by the time we want to make this into something that works in a production environment, those terms need to be persistently identifiable and potentially have version histories and links between one another, which is quite a job. So I don't know what your thinking is potentially around that.
No, that's a really good question. So I'll say maybe firstly, that the creation of the glossary or the vocabulary within the model was something I did to keep my head straight while organizing the model. And so I'm just really excited that it's being considered as more of a side note. So thank you. But in terms of making it more formal, we're actually looking at having the entire model moved into a more persistently referenceable format. Yeah, we're not really planning to have it stay in the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was intended as a working document, but because we were so focused on the content, we felt it was just better to move forward with that container than to move it into a kind of a better format. That's a very near future piece of work that we want to do. And it would absolutely include the vocabulary. Exactly what that looks like at this point, I'm not 100% sure. I'm also happy for some of my co-chairs if they have ideas around this area to jump in, but we definitely want to move in that direction for not just the vocabulary and glossary, but for the entire model.
Yeah. So for the vocabulary, Wim, I hadn't actually thought of it until you asked the question. My organization, the Australian Research Data Commons, runs a vocabulary service. So we have a national vocabulary service that anyone can use to publish vocabularies with persistent identifiers for each of the elements. We could absolutely look at taking the vocabulary and migrating it into that system. Not something I'd thought about until you asked the question, but I can see no reason why we couldn't do that.
So like a volunteer effort from ARDC?
Sure, why not?
Love that.
Not a question, just a comment and a bit of praise or a bit of excitement anyway. I know how hard it is to track adoption stories, so I'm just going to give you an adoption story. We love the model. This is ARDC, Australia. We looked at the model and we went, yes, actually, that makes a lot of sense. And it's especially the graph, that picture, that image, that representation. And we had a look at it and we did need to translate it a little bit to our context, but even still, it seemed to fit quite nicely. And used it at the recent e-research conference in Australia as a discussion starter with institutions and people in the sector, trying to unpack where they play a role in an open research commons. So yeah, just a big thank you.
Well, nice, excellent. I'm glad that people are taking it up and using it.
Hi, I'm Matt Marinick from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the U.S. So just to echo that, actually, I wasn't familiar with this, but I've been having discussions with colleagues in my organization about an NCAR data commons. And in fact, we had a meeting planned for next week about this, and I've just forwarded them this diagram, and I think it's going to be great. So super fantastic about that. I think I'm struggling a little bit with a bigger picture vision, just in the sense that in my organization, which is, relatively speaking, I'm sure somewhat small and homogeneous, we've been working maybe for 10 years and, on some of these things. And so I'm struggling a little bit with sort of the scope of what you're hoping to achieve beyond these resources, which are fantastic. How pragmatically reasonable is it to build a global research commons, given how diverse we all are here in this organization or in this conference?
That's a really excellent question. And I feel like anyone in the room who's looking at developing a commons or who runs one right now will tell you that it's probably not easy regardless. But we are trying to kind of fill those gaps. So what this was intended to do was say, when you are building a commons or even looking to expand what you have into a national commons, or it could be discipline specific as well. This was kind of intended to have a guideline of what are all the things you should consider when you're writing your proposals, or when you're looking to extend your services, or when you're looking to build on what you've already got, depending on the case. So the scope for this was really intended to address the building as well as the further development of. And so certainly when we say model and framework, those are theory words, right? Like this is a model. It's not an implementation layer. It's not an implementation map. This is not telling you how to build a commons. This is saying, what should you consider when you're addressing that? And one of the things we do really want to do is actually help with the how part. So that's kind of the scope. This is kind of our first attempt at creating a theory behind what even is a commons. What do we actually mean by that? What could it include? And then move it into the space of the practical application of how. But that how part is currently a work in progress. Does that answer your question? Excellent.
Yeah, hi, my name is Lauren Maxwell. I'm coming from Universitätsklinikum Heidelberg, and my work is in pandemic preparedness and response. And so we see just a fantastic opportunity to implement this vocabulary in health data commons. Because in the health data space, we are not fair. And so because we have so many ontologies and so much siloed data, and that those data are so important, we really want to see, I think your point, what are other people doing? So can we get everybody to do the same thing? Yeah, absolutely not. But can we show people what other, and when I say people, I mean governments, citizens, what are these other commons doing to try to drive fair convergence? Absolutely. And I think that this is a fantastic basis on which to drive that work. And I think, like as the colleagues from ADRC were saying, each kind of community of practice has to come together and see, okay, what changes do we need to make this work for my particular use case? So in the health data case, I think there will have to be a lot of discussions facilitated around, what are the priorities for health data and how do those fit within this overarching approach? But what we'd like to see happen is to build this out in RDF, JSON-LD, and make a knowledge graph such that we can show the connections between these different commons. And then what we have are, so I'm coming from CoData, where this thinking about the connections between health data commons was case study that we started during COVID, and it's been slow going because we have no funding support. But we've been trying to drive it forward. And so when we came across this work, we thought, fantastic, you're doing the job that we also wanted to do. And so in the health data space, we like to see this built out in semantics, and then implemented in knowledge graph, and then show the folks who are working to build their commons, okay, these are what the implementers are already doing. Do you also want to, use this for machine actionable governance structure, use this for interoperability at these levels of health data? Because we really need to coordinate in how we're implementing FAIR so that we can then use subject level data across these systems. So we see it as less of like, okay, everybody's going to converge on one way forward, but by making these decisions evident, then we can drive coordination, and then we can work towards cross commons reuse of health data. And I also want to, so I was a latecomer to this working group. So I was in the Digital Repositories Attribute Working Group, which was also fantastic. But I just want to say how much of a pleasure it has been to work with CJ and just the leadership of this group. And all of us are, I'd say many of us do this because we're passionate, not because, this is our fun, extra add-on part of work. And your leadership and just fantastic coordination of this group made it a real pleasure to come to these meetings. And every single person I've talked to has said the exact same thing without any prompting, just like how thrilled they are to be part of this group because of just your fantastic leadership. So I want to thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I will maybe just add on to Lauren's point. Well, I'm blushing and being flustered. That one of the things that we are really interested in doing in future work, and we're hoping to have some discussion time for that, is looking at discipline-specific applications of the model, because right now it is quite generalist, and that's good because it means it can be hopefully generalizable. And applied to multiple situations, but it is really intended for you to take it into your own context and say what considerations are important. And then also we're hoping for feedback to say what considerations are we missing for specific discipline contests like health data. And I'm hoping to work with Lauren on that actually more specifically. Any other, I don't see any questions from online. Oh, there is a question here. Yeah, go for it, Dave.
Right. So I'm David Castle. I chair the SC for World Data System. So everything that Lauren said, plus one for me as well. But I'd also like to say that some years back, Benoit Purin at Ocean Networks Canada and I created the International Technology Office. And so I'm the PI on the award that actually sustains our contribution to this effort. And I'll just chime in and say it's just been an absolute delight to see how well this working group has gone. And thank you, CJ, for everything you've done to make it happen. It's it's fantastic, pro-grade piece of work in my opinion, and it's a real thrill to see it come out in part due to our work with the ITO. I did have a more specific question too, which is maybe you don't actually have it in the spec. I can't recall it myself, but maybe you can just give some general guidance about this since you've been in deep with this model for so long, which is the following. I mean, I get the idea that it's not prescriptive, that in a way this really is, it's a conceptual apparatus which serves as both kind of a map. It's a conceptual framework in that respect, but it's also a heuristic because it tells you what to think, gives you indications about what you should think about as you're trying to create some sort of a research commons. But the thing I find interesting about it is that you could apply it to things both large and small. You could say global or intergalactic research commons, or you could say my country's research commons, or my provinces, or my universities, or my research project, right? So like it can be adapted at many different layers of complexity and scale. But then the question that I have is whether or not you actually have in the model or could think in the future about actually providing some guidance about what kind of scaling heuristics people might actually want to think about and apply and you know, go through the 400 odd lines that you actually have in the model and think about the ones that would be appropriate for thinking about commons which are more or less complicated in terms of the types of data that they have, but then also just the scale at which they're going to operate. Because I think that if you were to do that, then it would really, that and other things, I think would actually really lead nicely into people being able to think about all sorts of application domains, but not have to think about how to get some application rules in place to think about questions like scale, which is one of perhaps many different types of considerations that you would have to think about in order to be able to take the model into many, many different contexts. So that's kind of a question, but maybe it's just more of a suggestion too, because at least the way I'm thinking about it is, you know, I've got a job to do now with trying to work out yet another attempt to get a national data governance framework in place in the Canadian context. We've got this health data problem as well in the Canadian context, you know, like, and these things operating at different scales and different types of complexity of data. So I'm, you know, I'm thinking, oh God, I'd love to be able to adapt this, but I don't really know if I've got a set of rules to do that yet. So any thoughts you have about that? Otherwise, it's just a suggestion.
No, it's a great suggestion. And I'll mention a couple of things. So in terms of the granularity of the applicability of the model, again, we had 12 speakers that fed into the creation of the model. One of them, well, there was a couple of them that were discipline specific, but I'll use it on maybe a discipline specific national scale was kind of like the smaller scale that we looked at, which was the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, or CICADI. And that's like quite a small team. There's very few people that work on it full time. It's work that's done by multiple people at different universities in Canada and internationally. So that was kind of what I would consider one end of it, but also the European Open Science Cloud was considered too. And so that's obviously, I don't mean to say like one's on either end of the spectrum, but I think we can all agree that EOSC is maybe on its own scale even, as well as the African Open Science Platform too. So we were trying to really look at that different granularity and build it in such that you can scale it up or down depending on your context. I would even argue that individual repositories could use the model as well. There will be some aspects of it that aren't relevant for data repositories. And then you would just say, okay, I'm not going to look at those categories because we don't offer data management services. Okay. That's totally fine. They're just considerations. But some of the governance stuff could be helpful. The sustainability stuff could be helpful. The human capacity stuff is going to be helpful. So in terms of granularity, there's that. In terms of looking at stage or a maturity of it, a maturity matrix for the model is something that we are actively considering creating and is one of the things that we do want to investigate and attempt. I actually did an analysis of all 12 speakers across the model as a way to say, okay, if you want to be EOSC, this is all the things in the model that EOSC does and how they do them. That's not part of our published outputs because it has not been checked, but I will say like we do have that data. So if you want to get a quick overview, come find me, I guess. But we do have kind of this waiting in the wings looking to do that analysis. In addition to kind of defining what commons types there are and the dimensions that you can consider when you're thinking about what kind of commons am I. And I'm doing this because that's not formalized, but it is a piece of work that I did during the working group and waiting in the wings, so it's not official or published. But we are looking to kind of take these pieces and include it when we're making an implementation map of the model to say, how do you get there? What considerations? How would you make the decisions on which considerations? In the short term, however, we do have those consideration levels. And so kind of the way that we were also thinking about the consideration levels is that if you're building a commons, you would go with core first. Or you think about core first, and then you would look at desirable, and then you would look at optional. And certainly not everything in core is going to be relevant to your context because it's not prescriptive, but that was a light level way that we've already built it in. But yes, we have things waiting in the wings to kind of get to that addressing how does the model work for different contexts. Yeah.
CJ, can I
Yeah.
suggest we take one more question, and then maybe it would help people if we actually, I know the spreadsheet's a little overwhelming, but I think it would give people a sense of what the detail looks like. But there's one more question there first, I think.
Yep.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you for the fantastic work and all these different requirements you managed to gather. My question is, are there any working examples that you derived your requirements from, or any working examples that are applying the requirements to actually achieve a real data commons, even in a small area, that I then know that I can follow this and I will create a data commons that actually works?
Yes, and there are. So we are hoping to resubmit the model as an RDA recommendation with adoption stories. And so we do have a few people that have agreed to be those adopters, and we're hoping to showcase them as like the first step, and then to help, and then a few others that we're hoping to work with a little more informally to also use as working examples. I am not 100% on saying them out loud right now because I don't want them to feel like I'm undercutting them. But the answer is yes, we do have working examples and people who are using the model currently. And when we have, and we're hoping to release some of that information and data basically as soon as possible. So yeah, so under development, I guess.
Brilliant. That's even greater. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so in terms of seeing what the model is, because yeah, we've talked a lot about it, and exit full screen, that would have been easier before. So we do want to showcase a little bit of what the report looks like and what the model looks like. So the report I'm going to do first because it's a bit easier, as it's been highlighted multiple times. So we have everything available in Google Documents. So the report's still available as a Google Doc, open for comments. Changing this one is not open because it's a published piece of work, but we're hoping that any comments that are made dynamically on it, we can integrate for considerations on future work of the model, which is helpful. So that's why it's still open in Google Doc that you can go comment on. Same with the model, it's still available in a Google Sheet with comment enablement access, because we are still interested in your feedback on it, even though that particular sheet's going to be is timestamped as version 1. So the document itself won't change, but I encourage you to go look at them and leave comments and suggestions because that's helpful for our future work, or to email me or any of the co-chairs as well. So just in terms of the international model report, some of the things that you can expect to find in that are, of course, background, methods, the results for each individual essential element, as well as for KPIs and metrics. And then we've got some nice appendices here for those of you who might have had questions, but didn't ask them today that might answer it as well. So we had a questionnaire for our speakers, the mapping of that, all the sources that we did review, because I've referred to those literature reviews a little bit. So you might be curious, what did we actually consider? And who was actually in those task groups? So that's the report, all the things that you can expect in there. The model is 150 zoom in enough, kind of. Right, everyone's like, I'm not going to read it anyway. So the Excel spreadsheet that's on Zenodo looks pretty much identical to the Google Sheet, with the exception of it has a link to the Google Sheet in the Excel file, because we do want you to go leave comments on stuff. So this gives you a description of what the model is, some links to the supporting documentation, and how to cite it. You've also got a summary of what's in each tab. So total items, what types of considerations are in there, how many categories and subcategories, how many attributes and features. And then this is the number that I keep referring, like about 400. So 396 were the total considerations. The actual part of the model was about 292. You don't have to remember that, but this glossary is what's been referred to a few times. So as you can see right now, it exists as a tab. And the idea is that everything in the model that has an asterisk on it is referring to a specifically defined term in the glossary. So that just a heads up, if you look at this later, your cells, you see what are all these asterisks doing around? They're referring to the glossary. And then after that, every tab besides introduction and glossary refer to a particular area of the model. So of course, governance and leadership, rules, participation and access, so on and so forth. And then KPIs and metrics are at the end because they are in addition to the model, not so much of the model, even though they do refer to them. So I'm going to choose engagement because they're all structured the same way. So when you go into a tab and you're like, okay, what are the things I need to consider? What you'll see is a flat representation, which is why we want to move it into a different format, because the flat representation is a little hard to navigate. But for now, the essential element will always be listed at the top. The items that you're actively viewing are there. This is a dynamic field. And then category, subcategory, so your entities and the attributes and features of them are afterwards. It's also been color coded. So hopefully the color coding or the organization work for you, or both, hopefully one of those. So these are the things that are part of the model, your labels, if you will. Everything, as I said, has an extended description, example, consideration level, and the primary sources. So we try to include as much as we could, but it's really these columns A through D that tell you what it is, and then more information to the right. The way that we've structured this is that top level attributes and features or characteristics apply to the essential element. So they would apply to all categories and subcategories within the essential element. So for example, a structured, coordinated, and implemented communication and engagement plan and mechanism, media, or channels to operate through it applies to everything in engagement. That's not isolated. So it applies to all of the categories that are going to be below it. And that's the idea there. So these characteristics are inherited from parent to child. Features are more granular aspects of attributes. So we're trying to go further and further down the granularity tree there. We did stop ourselves at features, as you noticed. Categories are these entities. So community input and feedback is a category of engagement. It has its own characteristics to consider. And then some of these categories will also have subcategories where you get into further granularity of the entities themselves. And so, for example, incentivization to intended audiences to participate in or with the commons as a category of engagement. A finer subcategory of that is the consultation or events themselves that you would do. Sometimes these subcategories will also have their own characteristics, and we're really going with this familial hierarchy of depending on how things are nested, attribute characteristics belong to the subcategories, or they belong to a category and are inherited by the subcategories, or they belong to the essential element and are inherited by everything in that particular tab. So yeah, a flat layout, which is why we are really interested in changing the format for it, but all the content is still in there. Thank you, Andrew. I'm being heckled by myself. That was the Zoom. I am also watching the Zoom here. I don't see any questions in the Zoom, but please, if folks have questions online, let us know. So that's kind of the overview of how it works. And even just looking at maybe a technical one, ICT infrastructure, you've still got top level attributes and features. And this is an example of how characteristics can apply to the categories and subcategories themselves. So network infrastructure is a category of ICT infrastructure. Knowledge and management of your network infrastructure is an attribute of that. You can have internal or external network infrastructure, and knowledge of both of those things is relevant. So that attribute is inherited by those subcategories. So it's a bit of a technical piece. The only other thing I'll note is that we did put these slicers in up top. So you can say, for example, if you wanted to, as per David's question, if you wanted to look at what are just the core things I need to look at, this is just too much. You can just deselect desirable and optional and say, okay, I only want to look at the core stuff. ICT infrastructure is not a good example. There's a lot of things that are core in there, but you can see that the number of items in view went from 28 to 20. Likewise, if you're like, okay, I've addressed all my core things, I want to look at desirable, you just say, I want to only look at the desirable things, and you'll see what items are relevant for that. So a kind of a light way of navigating the model, if you're overwhelmed by these tabs as they come into them, you can organize them by their consideration level, or you can look at all the consideration levels at once, which is the default view. The very last one that I'll mention is KPIs and metrics, because that's not organized in the same way. Kind of the same way it still has a splicer, but not really. So KPIs and metrics have themes, and I listed the themes, but they have these pink themes. In each theme, there's KPIs, and then there's metrics. And these are a starting point that you can consider when building, especially regarding your strategic plan, your operational plan around what do we care about? What do we want to measure? And then how could we maybe measure that? We're hoping that this is a starting point for you to do this. Likewise, they have consideration levels, blanks because the themes don't have consideration levels. That was probably an oversight on my part. And you still have extended descriptions and examples, sources to refer to. And with those KPIs, we've also offered thinking about whether you need external information or internal information to measure, what development stage you might be at. So if you are an established commons, for example, that has a little bit more information available to you, that's what established means. Developing means you're building. And initial means this is a metric you should maybe think about having as you are building. Like if your commons is brand new, this is really important for you to have or consider having, of course. It also has links back to the model. So measurement of, indicator of for the essential elements, an affiliated part of the model that it's referring to, and the reasoning that I had to put it in there in this way. So I'm going to leave it there. a quick overview of the model. It will require some going through, and we're thinking about right now, how do we help people guide through it? And part of that is going to be putting in a different format. Part of that might be consultations with our adopters. And that's a work in progress too. So I think from there, we'll move on to the open discussion part. Things that are kind of expected is that this version of the working group has achieved its deliverables. It will go into maintenance mode. The interest group will work on the integration roadmap because that's its goal. What else do we need to think about, and what new working groups do we need to start, and what should we work on first? So these are some examples. We're going to go back to Mentimeter, and we're going to hear about what you'd like to discuss first, because we've only got about 15 more minutes in this session and we'd like to focus the discussion. So I'm actually going to go back to the Mentimeter slide, and then we'll switch over to Mentimeter, I think.
So actually, before you go into that, it's probably useful just to run people through these, because I just took one word for the Mentimeter.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
So, so the options of what you may want to discuss: adoption of the model, profiles of the model by discipline. So we had the example of the health commons before, or maturity, mapping of the model to other RDA and community outputs, expanding the model to include research hardware or physical research infrastructure, which was flagged by CJ as well, expanding the model to include an implementation, recommendation and examples for each item, or expanding the model to include maturity levels and examples for each of those kind of levels of maturity as well. So those are the options, and we've just got one word on the Menti. So think about what areas you want to discuss first. And then, sorry, can you open up the? Oh, can you? Oh, I meant to make it multiple choice. So pick your top priority, and then we can hone in on that on discussion.
So you should be good to use the arrows where the mouse is up here.
Yeah, the mouse is here.
I'll just stay up here.
Okay, the implementation is the top one so far, and adoption cases as well. The question was, sorry, oh, Natalie.
It's about what is the fine line between adoption and implementation? Is adoption saying we're going to do it and we'll tell you about it?
Adoption is picking up on the adoption cases, and implementation is looking at implementation examples, as far as I recall from your slide, and writing those into the model.
So maybe more specifically, the adoption of the model itself is a way of consideration or guidance. So, and then the implementation is like an implementation map. So specifically the how for each and every item in the model. So essentially another layer of guidance on top of it. That's the difference.
Thanks.
Okay, so in terms of our top themes, we have the implementation. So actually trying to write this into the model, given the examples, and the adoption. So I think we should open the floor to questions or comments again.
Yeah, so the priority for me is the health data common space, because I think we have a lot of opportunities there, especially since folks are just getting kind of starting to implement. So I think if we can bring them in from the bottom up and give them some ownership of this vocabulary, how they can build it out, and then we can build it out in RDF JSON-LD, and then show them the value of understanding these connections as they evolve to drive this coordination. I think that'd be fantastic. I really liked David's comments about like applying this to research infrastructure. So one thing that I think is so impressive about the oceans data space is they have fantastic work around bringing together the community, making evident through through semantics and a nicely structured knowledge graph, what are these different infrastructures doing? And then it's not that the infrastructures are telling us what they're doing, which often is our default, or the information is just not available at all. They're doing this through the semantic web, and so these are federated machine actionable metadata to describe these infrastructures, and that has really helped drive coordination in the oceans data space. And so I think that using this, using the fantastic work that you all have done, as a starting point for research infrastructures in other spaces to, you know, I mean, it's a lot of information and I agree that there would have to be some changes. But I do think it would be very nice to apply this, the oceans kind of approach using the schema. So building it out in RDF TSNLD as I did in oceans, thinking about Sparkle and Shackle rules on top of that to make sure that we that the data correspond to what's happening. And also what Oceans has done is working with the infrastructures to help them understand their place in the knowledge graph. And then if they don't have the right metadata exposed, then they need to expose the metadata. So that is really important for us, trying to understand the evolution of these infrastructure spaces and to drive coordination across infrastructure so we can get to all the levels of interoperability that we need. So I think that would be another really nice application for this.
Yeah, Ari has a comment at the back. Andrew.
Ari asked me from the Research Data Alliance Europe. Okay, good. Just actually following your concept discussion about data spaces. So I was a little bit predictive, and I sent this already the model also to the Data Spaces Support Center, because I do know that they are trying to model these similar things as well. Just thinking of the branding, which was kind of mentioned before, that, I mean, there's the terms of global and open, and actually just kind of question that how many of the attributes actually require global and open in the model. To me, at least, I don't see that much. In sustainability, maybe, but other than that, just thinking where this could be implemented. Also, because, I mean, I think you had an example of using this for universities or something like that. So, which could be kind of, we could think about how to engage with these communities, and then we have to think about the terminology, what we want to use when approaching them. I don't know, this was not a question, but maybe a comment.
Yeah, I think it's an important comment because it can be applied at multiple different levels. So it doesn't have to be the scale of EOSC. We can apply it, you know, at a much kind of smaller scale as well. Gone quiet. Yeah, Ari again.
If there is no other questions, then I can maybe continue. I'm just wondering here, if we are wanting now to test this adoption in different cases, and especially if you want to find this kind of whatever canonical examples of different things, probably in different scales of the model, how do we want to keep this information? I mean, how do we want to collect this? And could we also try to figure out also perhaps from the, well, Wim disappeared, but from the RDA maintenance facility point of view. So we could try to figure out what would be the best way to collect this kind of information in a sense that everybody can then see how people have adopted or implemented this model in different contexts. I don't know, do you have an idea already, or should we discuss this in a separate way?
I think that it's something that we can absolutely discuss, because what we want to do, obviously, for the GORC interest group and working group is hear from the community and what's going to be most relevant and present, and how presentation of information is going to be best. In terms of how the information is showcased, unfortunately, right now we're still working in spreadsheets.
Yes,
so there's that.
Yeah, I do know, and we have had that discussion.
Yeah.
Already earlier. I'm already stepping forward with the next step of that. But yeah.
Yeah. So I think in terms of collection, it'll probably be still in a spreadsheet format, but how to communicate it, I think one thing that we do need to do is have it in a narrative. Mm. Outside of that, I think it's open. We have ideas, but nothing concrete at this point.
It would be also actually quite interesting to see, we have quite a lot of people in this room, that how many could kind of at least lightly want to test this one in their own organization, because it could be just interesting to know that if people are here just to read emails, or if there is kind of interest here.
All right, show of hands. Is anyone interested in at least kind of opening the document and trying? Few? Nice. Well, we definitely encourage that. And because we're still working on like what does adoption mean for a theoretical model and then also moving towards that implementation map, we definitely encourage you to go ahead and look at it and read the parts that are relevant and important for you, but also to please reach out to the working group, the interest group, myself, Andrew, Sarah, our other co-chairs, Devika, Mark, or Javier, and ask for guidance or consultation. One of the main things we are looking at for adopters of the model itself is a consultation process where we help walk them through the model until it's in a more usable format. So all of those are very open. You don't have to do things by yourself. So if that helps, please do. Feel free to reach out. Oh yeah, and I'll remind you, as Andrew said, if you want to use the model, there's some really good examples of what an implementation from the essential element all the way down to a feature could look like. And we have them laid out in the brochure. So it's not an example of all possible implementations of everything in the model, because again, we have to work on that, but we had some ideas that are exemplified in those brochures. So I encourage you to come take one. They're up, yeah, already has them up here, and then they're also at the RDA Tiger table. Any other comments or questions on discussion?
Since we have a little time. So we talked about health data, and there's been a number of sessions here that focus on disaster response and the need for kind of cross-domain action and disaster response. So I think it's great to have health at the table because we're really far behind, climate, oceans, deep earth in terms of disaster response data interoperability. But it would be nice if we do think about moving forward with mapping the health research commons, if we had another domain on board so that we could think about the utility of cross-domain data for disaster response and pandemic preparedness. And I think in terms of who can we reach out to first, it would be great to just take this to policymakers. So there's a nice funding space where it's policy and funders together really called GloBidR in pandemic preparedness that I think would be fantastic to reach out to for health data. But I don't work really in these other data types. I'm curious to see if anybody in the audience sees, in the area that I'm working in, like climate or oceans, we really see this connection with health data, and we'd like to do this in our space. And then we could think about cross-domain intersections, within and across these global open research commons.
Yeah, excellent. I think, the more profiles of discipline-specific application we can do, the better.
Yeah, thanks, Matt Mernick again from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the US. Just to follow up on that, I think the point about using this to communicate to funders is really fantastic. And I think there's a level of granularity and of sort of usefulness of this information, right? Like the full list of 292 or 390 elements. Maybe I'll look at that. And maybe there are 2 other people in my organization who will look at that. At sort of individual sections, maybe a small team will look at those. And I think that'll be useful for small teams. But within my organization, I can totally see taking this, as I already said, the diagram to everybody. And the directors of my organization who deal with funding, I think it's very clear. So again, I think that's fantastic. And I think, our major funder is National Science Foundation in the US. They need to see this and they need to understand this. And I think because we've gotten some questions about some of these things that I think we've tried to communicate some of these details that this will really help with. So I think this is going to be a great tool for communication. And some of the more detailed stuff will be useful for smaller groups. But I think in whole, it's a nice stack. And so I think I really appreciate the work that you've done here.
Thank you. I will also maybe echo that one of our adopters that we have been working with and hope to continue working with, they found it was really helpful to look at the governance and policy area. So like the white, if I can find where the model is again. So looking at the this one, yeah. So at the white elements, they found it really helpful, just like, leave it at that for kind of their top folks who make the decisions, management and governance, and then go into the light blue, compute, storage, network AI, research object services and tools, like all the way down into the extended descriptions and examples with folks that are actually doing the implementation of those services and hardware there. And that's kind of what we're hoping to reflect in the adoption, is actually start at the essential element level, and then you would kind of have like a branched approach and say, okay, what do I want to work in next? And then you go down a level of granularity every time you have a new question. So yeah, that's excellent. That's exactly what we would hope people would do, is start at the top and work their way down instead of just starting at the bottom layer. Flat representations have that issue for sure. Okay, so we are very close to the end of the session. So I do want to thank everyone who raised comments and suggestions and asked questions. That was really, really helpful for us. We're going to, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, we keep this Mentimeter, right? Like we're going to just have these results, they don't disappear. Okay, so the results don't disappear. Excellent. This is really helpful. For here, go back into full screen. So as we said, the report on the model are up on the RDA outputs page now. They don't have a card yet for an RDA card, but they are on Zenodo, so you can go and interact with them and see them. And as you've also seen, they are online too, and we encourage you to interact with them in either space. We're trying to consider what areas of work to prioritize, and we've heard a couple of options here today, and consider what can be done by the working group in maintenance mode versus what needs new working groups. So are we going to go start 5 working groups? Probably not, but we do need to maybe have 1 or 2 working groups to take on aspects of this work, because the international model working group as it is can't do it all in maintenance mode. So that's kind of the next steps for us, is to figure out what's going to spin up, what's going to have a case statement, and start working on that back end part to get the work started. The interest group, however, is still very active. So if you don't want to miss a meeting or an update, please sign up for the interest group. This is all of us in the chair positions, and we encourage you to reach out to us individually, separately, or through the interest group itself. And thank you so much for coming to our session this morning. We'll be here afterwards to have conversations if you'd like. Thank you.